In the quiet town of Burlington, Vermont, in 1859, a boy named John Dewey was born into a modest family. His father owned a small grocery store, and his mother was a woman of strong moral values who loved reading. From an early age, John was curious, sometimes too curious for the comfort of his teachers. While other children memorized lessons without question, John often raised his hand and asked, "Why?" His teachers didn't always appreciate this. In those days, schools valued discipline and memorization over creativity. But John's curiosity refused to be silenced. He would walk home from school, thinking about everything he saw, the people, the markets, the fields, and wonder how people learned what they knew. Why do we learn this way? He often thought. When he entered the University of Vermont, John began to find answers. He studied philosophy, fascinated by how people think and reason. One of his professors noticed his deep interest in logic and encouraged him to explore further. John realized that knowledge was not something to be given, it was something to be discovered. This simple idea would later change education forever. After graduating, John began teaching high school. But standing before a room of restless students, he felt uneasy. The system demanded that he lecture and test, but he could see boredom in his students' eyes. He wanted them to experience learning, not just repeat it. Every time he watched a child struggle to stay awake during a lesson, he asked himself, "Is this what education should be?" When his first article on philosophy was published, John gained confidence. He decided to continue his studies and entered Johns Hopkins University. There, he was surrounded by brilliant thinkers and scientists. He explored psychology, philosophy, and the workings of the human mind. He learned that people do not learn in isolation. They learn by doing, observing, and engaging with the world. But Dewey's early life was not all easy. He struggled financially, often juggling work and study. He spent long nights reading by candlelight, determined to understand how people learn best. The more he studied, the more he realized that education was not about filling empty minds. It was about developing thinking minds. By the time John completed his doctorate, he had formed a dream. He wanted to reshape education, not for the privileged few, but for every child, rich or poor. He imagined schools where students could ask questions, experiment, and connect their lessons to real life. To him, learning was not preparation for life, it was life itself. And so, with passion and vision, the boy who once asked why was now ready to answer that question for the world. When John Dewey began his first teaching position at the University of Michigan, he carried with him more questions than answers. The classrooms he saw looked much like those from his childhood. Rows of wooden desks, teachers standing at the front, and students silently copying notes. It was efficient, yes, but lifeless. Dewey watched as students memorized facts for exams and then forgot them soon after. Education, he thought, should be more than passing tests. It should shape minds, not just fill them. Dewey spent hours observing how students responded to lessons. He noticed that when learning connected to their daily lives, they became more alert, more curious. One day, during a philosophy discussion, a student asked, "Professor, how does this idea actually help us live better?" Dewey smiled. That question, he thought, was the essence of learning, to think critically about real experience. In his small study, late at night, he began writing his ideas. He believed that knowledge came from interaction, between the learner and the environment, between thought and action. He wrote that children learn best when they are actively engaged, building, experimenting, asking questions. This was a radical thought at the time. Most educators believed in strict discipline and repetition. Dewey, however, saw the classroom as a miniature society where students should learn by doing. When he moved to the University of Chicago in the 1890s, Dewey finally had the chance to turn his philosophy into practice. With the help of his wife, Alice, he founded the University of Chicago Laboratory School in 1896. It wasn't just a school. It was a living experiment. The classrooms were filled with energy. Children cooked, sewed, painted, and built things with their hands. Instead of memorizing facts about history, they recreated ancient life through projects. Science lessons involved real experiments, not just reading from books. Dewey watched as the children's eyes lit up with excitement. They weren't just learning, they were thinking. Other educators were curious, some even shocked. "Where are the textbooks?" one visitor asked. Dewey replied calmly, "The world itself is a textbook." Parents were equally surprised when they saw their children coming home full of stories about what they made and discovered that day. Dewey's methods were unusual, but the results were undeniable. Students were developing creativity, cooperation, and problem-solving skills. Through these experiences, Dewey began shaping his famous educational philosophy, learning by doing. He believed that education should not be preparation for life. It should be life itself. Every activity, every question, every challenge was an opportunity for growth. But not everyone agreed. Some critics accused him of destroying discipline and order in the classroom. Dewey faced doubt and criticism, yet he remained calm. "Education," he said, "is not about telling children what to think, but teaching them how to think." In those years at Chicago, John Dewey became more than a professor. He became a reformer, a thinker who dared to believe that learning should be alive, practical, and deeply human. By the early 1900s, John Dewey had become a name whispered with admiration in academic circles. His experiments in the Chicago Laboratory School were not just successful, they were revolutionary. But while some praised him as a visionary, others criticized him as too idealistic. Dewey, however, did not seek fame. His mission was far greater, to make education the foundation of a democratic society. When Dewey accepted a position at Columbia University in New York, he found himself at the heart of a new world, vibrant, diverse, and full of change. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping America. Immigrants from around the world were arriving, factories were rising, and cities were growing faster than ever. Society needed not only skilled workers but thinking citizens. Dewey believed education could make that possible. He began giving lectures that attracted students, teachers, and reformers from everywhere. His words carried warmth and conviction. "Democracy," he said, "is more than a system of government. It is a way of living together." He believed that schools were the best place to practice democracy, where students learned cooperation, respect, and shared responsibility. In 1916, Dewey published his masterpiece, Democracy and Education. The book argued that education was not about memorizing old facts, but about preparing individuals to participate meaningfully in society. He wrote that when schools encouraged curiosity and communication, children learned how to solve problems collectively, the same skills a healthy democracy needed. His ideas spread across America and beyond. Teachers began experimenting with his methods. Schools introduced group projects, discussions, and practical learning. For the first time, students were encouraged to express opinions, ask questions, and work together. Education was slowly shifting from obedience to understanding. But Dewey's influence was not limited to classrooms. He became an active voice in public affairs, speaking about social justice, peace, and equality. He believed education could not be separated from life. It should serve the betterment of all. During times of war and political tension, Dewey argued for critical thinking and open dialogue instead of blind nationalism. "We do not learn from experience," he said. "We learn from reflecting on experience." At Columbia, Dewey inspired a generation of young educators who would carry his ideas worldwide. He encouraged them to travel, observe different cultures, and bring back lessons that could improve learning everywhere. He often told them, "The teacher's task is not to impose ideas, but to awaken possibilities." Through his writing and teaching, Dewey transformed from a quiet philosopher into an international figure. Governments and reformers from Asia to Europe sought his advice. He believed that true education should adapt to society's needs, but never lose its soul. Even as his fame grew, Dewey remained humble. He continued to walk to his lectures, carrying a simple briefcase filled with notes and books. His dream was still the same as it was in his youth, to make education alive, meaningful, and human. The world was listening, and Dewey's philosophy of democracy and education was beginning to change not just classrooms, but minds. By the 1920s, John Dewey was no longer just an American educator. He was a global thinker. His ideas about learning, democracy, and experience had traveled far beyond the United States. Letters arrived from Europe, Asia, and South America. Reformers, teachers, and even politicians wanted to meet the man who had redefined what education could be. One of Dewey's most significant journeys began in 1919, when he accepted an invitation to China. The country was going through a period of great change, seeking new ways to modernize its schools and society. When Dewey arrived, he was surprised to see thousands of students and teachers waiting to hear him speak. To them, he was a symbol of progress, a man who believed that thinking freely was the path to a better future. For 2 years, Dewey traveled throughout China, giving lectures and visiting schools. He spoke about learning through experience, about teachers as guides rather than rulers, and about the importance of democratic thinking. His words inspired many young educators, including some who would later become leading figures in China's educational reform. Dewey's ideas about critical thinking and problem-solving fit perfectly with a nation eager for renewal. During his time there, Dewey didn't act like a distant scholar. He listened. He visited classrooms, observed students, and talked with teachers about their challenges. He admired how Chinese traditions valued respect for learning and harmony, and he often said, "Every culture has its wisdom. Education must learn from all." His stay in China left a deep impression on him, and on those who met him. After China, Dewey visited Japan and several European countries, where his ideas were also taking root. Progressive schools began to appear, places where children learned by doing, explored nature, and discussed ideas openly. Educators called him the father of modern education. But Dewey never sought such titles. He believed he was simply helping people rediscover what learning truly meant. As he grew older, his influence continued to expand. He returned to America to find his theories discussed in newspapers, universities, and teacher training colleges. Yet he often reminded others that his philosophy was not about rigid methods, it was about spirit. Education, he said, is not a recipe. It is a living process that grows with the child and the world around them. Even in his 70s, Dewey remained active. He wrote essays, gave lectures, and encouraged schools to focus on creativity, cooperation, and social responsibility. He saw education as the greatest tool for peace and understanding among nations. "If we teach today's children to think," he said, "we won't need to teach tomorrow's adults to fight." The world had many philosophers, but few who touched real lives the way John Dewey did. From small classrooms in Vermont to the universities of Beijing and Tokyo, his voice carried a single, timeless message: education is the key to a better world. By the time John Dewey reached his later years, his hair had turned silver, and his steps had slowed, but his mind remained sharp as ever. His days were filled with writing, reading, and quiet reflection. He often sat by the window of his study, looking out at the bustling streets of New York City, the city he had called home for decades. Though the world had changed beyond recognition since his birth in 1859, one thing had not: Dewey's belief that education could shape the destiny of humankind. In his 80s, he continued to write articles and books that challenged people to think about learning as a lifelong process. He rejected the idea that education ended when one left school. "We keep growing," he often said, "as long as we keep thinking." Even in retirement, he remained an active voice for democracy, peace, and intellectual freedom. He encouraged young educators to question, to observe, and to never stop improving their teaching. Visitors from around the world continued to come to see him. Some were famous scholars, others were ordinary teachers who had read his books. They would tell him how his ideas had changed their classrooms, how children now asked questions, worked together, and found joy in learning. Dewey would listen quietly, smile, and say, "Then my work has not been in vain." He lived long enough to witness the great global shifts of the 20th century: 2 world wars, the rise of new nations, and the spread of public education to millions. Though the world often seemed divided, he believed that the solution lay in better understanding through education. To him, teaching was not just about transferring knowledge, it was about building bridges between minds and hearts. In 1952, at the remarkable age of 92, John Dewey passed away peacefully. The news spread quickly through universities, schools, and educational circles worldwide. Many mourned his death, but even more celebrated his life. Newspapers called him America's greatest philosopher of education. Teachers held discussions about his methods. Students read his words aloud in classrooms that were freer, livelier, and more creative, just as he had dreamed. Today, his ideas live on in every child-centered classroom, every group project, and every teacher who believes that learning should connect to life. Whenever a teacher asks, "What do you think?" instead of, "What is the answer?" Dewey's spirit is there. Whenever students learn through play, experience, or reflection, his philosophy continues to guide them. More than a philosopher, John Dewey was a dreamer who believed in the power of thinking minds. His legacy reminds us that education is not about control, it is about freedom. It is about helping every individual discover their potential and contribute to a better society. And so, the boy from Vermont who once asked endless questions left behind a world full of thinkers. His life became the greatest lesson of all. We do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. John Dewey's reflection continues, and so does the learning of the world.